SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, dear students. Welcome to my class. This is lecture number 21. In this lecture, we will be studying the 4 acts passed by the British Parliament relating to Indian affairs. These acts came into known as Charter Acts. These acts were passed at the regular interval of 20 years. The first act was passed in 1793. After 20 years, the next Charter Act was passed in 1830, and it was followed by the third Charter Act in 1833, and after again 20 years, the fourth and the last Charter Act was passed. It was in 1853. We are going to study the circumstances behind the passage of these 4 Charter Acts, what were the major provisions of these acts, and make an assessment of these provisions of this act. What was the circumstance behind the passage of the first Charter Act? It was because of the expansionist policy adopted by Napoleon in Europe. In the background of the Napoleonic danger, the English East India Company was to strengthen their possessions in India. It was in this background of Napoleonic danger, the British government aimed to strengthen their colonial positions, and in this background, the first Charter Act was passed by the British Parliament in 1793. What were the major provisions of the Charter Act of 1793? The commercial activity of the English East India Company was extended for another term of 20 years under this Act. And you may recall that through the Amending Act of 1786, when Lord Cornwallis was appointed, he was given the overriding power. Even if decisions were taken based on majority in the council of the Governor General or Governor General in council, this Governor General could override the majority decisions taken in this council. This overriding power, which had been granted to Lord Cornwallis through the Amending Act of 1786. Through the Charter Act of 1793, this power was given to other future Governor Generals of Bengal. And thirdly, the control of the Governor General of Bengal was strengthened on Bombay and Madras presidencies. So, first of all, it extended the administration of the English East India Company on Indian possessions for another round of 20 years. Overriding power was granted to Governor General of Bengal, and the control of the Governor General of Bengal over on Bombay and Madras presidencies were strengthened. These presidencies came into known as subordinate presidencies of the supreme government at Bengal. The next major provision was that during the absence of the Governor General at Bengal, he was empowered to appoint a vice president from the civilian members of his council to preside over the meetings of the Supreme Council. There were 2 types of members, one civilian, another member was Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces. only the civil member was to be appointed as the vice president to preside over the meetings of the Supreme Council in the absentia of Governor General at Bengal. Another provision was that when the Governor General visited the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras, he was to supersede the local governor as the head of the administration. It means that whenever the Governor General of Bengal visited the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras, the Governor General would become the head of the administration. And the qualifications to be appointed to the Council of Governor General as well as to the Governor's Council. Both the Governor General and the Governor had separate councils. What were the qualifications for appointment to the councils of Governor General as well as the Council of the Governor? Only a person resided in India for not less than 12 years to be appointed to the Council of the Governor General as well as the Council of the Governor. Whether Indians were able to get appointment either in the Council of the Governor General or the Governor, it was not possible. Only in 1909, first Indian was appointed in the Governors General Council. So, Indians did not get appointment to the Governors General Councils, only Britishers got appointment. Only the covenanted British civil servants got appointment as the member in the Governors General Council as well as in the Council of the Governor. In 1784, through the Pitt's India Act of 1784, the Commander-in-Chief was made as a member of the Governors General Council. But under the Charter Act of 1793, the Commander-in-Chief was no longer a member of the Governor General in Council. The Council of the Governor General would have 3 members. Through the first Act of Regulating Act, there were 4 members, but the number of members was reduced to 3 through the Pitt's India Act of 1784. The number of members in the Governor General in Council was reduced to 3 through the Pitt's India Act. As in the case of the Pitt's India Act, the number of members in the Governor General in Council was to be 3 under the Charter Act of 1793. In the Council of Governor in other presidencies, for example, Bombay Presidency and Madras Presidency as well, the number of members in the Governor Council would be 3. So, both in the Council of the Governor General as well as in the Council of Governor, the number of members was made 3. It reduced the number of members in the Board of Control from 6 to 5. As you recall that Board of Control was created to represent the British government to control the English East India Company as the representative of the British government. The Court of Directors was the representative of the English East India Company. The Board of Control would have a president as well as 2 junior members. The total number of members was to be 5. It would have a president as well as 2 junior members. The junior members was no longer. Earlier, these junior members were the members of the Privy Council, but this practice came to an end with the passage of the Charter Act of 1793. These junior members of the Board of Control were no longer the members of the Privy Council. all the members of the Board of Control whose salary was paid from Indian revenue. All the salaries of the members of the Board of Control were made from Indian revenue. It was another source of exploitation of the wealth of India. The members of the Board of Control were given high salary in order to meet the expenses arising out of the salary of the Board of Control. Huge amount of money was sent from India to Britain to meet the salary and other expenses of the Board of Control in Britain. Another change introduced through the Charter Act of 1793 was that the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court at Calcutta was extended to high seas. You recall that the Supreme Court at Calcutta was created through the Regulating Act of 1773. Earlier, it enjoyed jurisdiction over the people, whether it was Indians or the Britishers in Calcutta. Now, the jurisdictionary power of the Supreme Court at Calcutta extended to high seas. Another change introduced through the Charter Act of 1793 was that an annual statement was required to be placed before the British Parliament dealing with the affairs of the English East India Company in England as well as in India. This annual statement was to be placed before the British Parliament. Other provisions of the Act of 1793, dividends of the company was raised to 10%, and in addition to that, the company was required to pay 5 lakh rupees to the British government after the reduction of all expenses from the Indian revenue. It was another form of exploitation. Annually, this amount of 5 lakh drained out from India to Britain. The senior officials during their tenure were required not to leave India. It included the Governor General, the members of the Governor General in Council, the Governor of subordinate presidencies of Madras and Bombay, and the members in the Governors Council in Bombay and Madras presidencies, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. All these officials were required not to leave India. If they left India, it would consider that they had resigned from the job. This change was introduced through the Charter Act of 1793. Centralization of power. Since the Bombay and Madras presidencies were made subordinate to the Supreme Government at Calcutta, all powers began to be concentrated in the hands of the Supreme Government. This Act, passed in 1793, also maintained that not to enter into aggressive wars with the Indian powers. It was the repetition of the Pitch India Act of 1784. There was a similar provision in the Pitch India Act of 1784 that English East India Company would not engage with aggressive wars with Indian powers. But violating this power, it was during the period of Wellesley as the Governor General of Bengal. The English East India Company engaged the 4th round of struggle with Tipu Sultan Mysore. Tipu Sultan at Mysore. In this 4th and the last round of struggle between the British forces and the English East India Company in 1799, Tipu was completely defeated and Tipu's dominions were shared between the Nizam of Hyderabad and the British. British got half of the dominions of the Tipu Sultan after his failure in the third round of struggle between the British forces and Tipu. So, it was the violation of this provision enshrined in the Charter Act of 1793. Now, coming to the next Charter Act of 1813. This Charter Act was passed after the elapse of 20 years in 1813. First of all, let us look at the circumstances behind the passage of the Charter Act of 1813. It was mainly because of the introduction of the continental system by Napoleon. With the introduction of this continental system by Napoleon, the British traders were not able to send their goods for sale to the port of the countries of the allies of the Napoleon. The allies of the Napoleon did not allow the import of the British goods by British traders. So, they were to found other places to send their manufactured goods. In addition, following which the Englishmen in Britain demanded the British government to end the monopoly of trade which was granted to the English East India Company. Only the English East India Company was allowed to engage in trade with India. No other British companies or persons were not allowed to engage in trade with India. It came into known as the trade monopoly of the English East India Company. So, since the continental system of Napoleon, the other traders who were interested in trade were not in a position to export their manufactured goods to the allies of the Napoleon. In this background, they demanded that the trade monopoly of the English East India Company should end. Other group was Christian missionaries. They also exercised heavy pressure on the British government to open India to them, to come to India and to spread Christianity in India. It was in this background Charter Act of 1813 was passed. There were two reasons. There were two reasons behind the passage of the Act of 1813. One, other traders in Britain also demanded to end the trade monopoly of English East India Company so that they would also engage in trade with India. Secondly, the Christian missionaries wanted to spread Christianity to India. They also exercised heavy pressure on British government to open India to them. It was in this background Charter Act of 1813 was passed. Now, coming to the major provisions. What were the major provisions of the Charter Act of 1813? One, the trade monopoly of English East India Company came to an end. This trade monopoly, which was granted in 1600 through a royal charter, which came to an end. However, the trade monopoly of the English East India Company came to an end, it continued to enjoy the trade monopoly with China. With China, the English East India Company made trade relations. By giving silver, the English East India Company purchased tea from China initially, and later they began to exchange with China the Indian products like cotton, ivory. With China, the Britishers exchanged these items and purchased tea. The monopoly of English East India Company in tea trade was also maintained, except its trade monopoly with China and trade in tea. All other trade monopoly of the English East India Company came to an end. Now, it was opened. India was opened to other traders in Britain as well as other private companies in Britain to engage in trade with India. This Charter Act of 1813 provided the company under its possession the territories and revenues of India for another round of 20 years. This sovereignty of Indian possessions or the control of the Indian possessions and territories in India was given to English East India Company subject to the sovereignty of British Crown for another 20 years. For the sovereignty of these Indian possessions and territories was vested with the British Crown. It was required to maintain separate accounts. The English East India Company was required to maintain separate accounts dealing with the commercial transactions as well as the territory revenues. The control of the Board of Control on English East India Company got further extended with the passage of the Charter Act of 1813. One of the important provisions of the Charter of 1813 was that it provided an amount to the tune of 1 lakh rupees for the educational upliftment of the native Indians. It was for the first time the ruling government accepted its responsibility for providing education to the native Indians, following which in 1835 through the famous Macaulay Minute, English system of education was introduced in India. It created far-reaching consequences in India. Christian missionaries who had made pressure on the British government to grant them permission to come to India and preach Christianity. So now India was opened to the Christian missionaries to come and spread their teachings. Next change, the offices of the governor and the commander-in-chief was to be filled by the court of directors, but it was to be approved by the British Crown. Before the approval of the British Crown, it was countersigned by the President of the Board of Control. In 1813, the English East India Company was given the legislative power, that is law making power. It was empowered to make regulations as well as power to make articles of war, that is it got empowered to make weaponry in India. And in Charter Act of 1813, provision was made for imparting training to both the civil and military officials of the servants of the company. After the closure of the Fort William College, Haileybury College in Britain, where Haileybury College in Britain, where training was given to the civil service officials, civil servants of the English East India Company. Earlier they had given training at Fort William College. It was abolished and the civil servants began to be given training in Haileybury College in Britain. The dividend of the company was fixed at 10%, 10.5%. It also empowered the local government to tax people, but it should be subjected to the jurisdictional powers of the Supreme Court. And another Supreme Court was created in Bombay. There had already been a Supreme Court existence in Madras. There was a provision in the Charter Act of 1813 for the creation of a Supreme Court at Bombay, but it was created only in 1823, even though the provision was made in the Charter Act of 1813. Coming to the assessment of the Charter Act of 1813. 1. The power of the British Crown and the Board of Control strengthened on the affairs of the English East India Company. The Crown and the Board of Control, whose powers on the English East India Company got strengthened with the passage of the Charter Act of 1813. It defined the sovereignty of the British Crown on Indian possessions. How would we come in to know that? In the Charter Act of 1813, it was clearly mentioned that the control of the Indian possessions and territories in India was given to the English East India Company, subject to the sovereign power of the British Crown. From this clause, it was clear that the sovereignty was vested with the British Crown, and the trade monopoly which the English East India Company had enjoyed for a long time came to an end. Another importance of the Charter Act of 1813 was that these Christian missionaries began to reach India and started spreading Christianity. They reached India aiming to spread the message of Jesus Christ as well as to get converts into Christianity from Hindus and Muslims. And as you have been told earlier, the Charter Act of 1813 provided on 1 lakh rupees for the educational upliftment of the native Indians. No doubt this provision had made far-reaching changes in India. It provided the growth of English learning in India. Now coming to the Charter Act of 1833. This Charter Act of 1833 was passed at the elapse of 20 years in 1833. First of all, let us start with the background behind the passage of the Charter Act of 1833. England witnessed great changes during the period between 1813 and 1833. What were the changes took place during this period spanning between 1813 and 1833? Industrial Revolution brought revolutionary changes in Britain. Production went up because of the extensive use of machines in these factories. The British manufactured products began to export to the different parts of the world, and a huge money was received by exporting these British manufactured products to different parts of the world, and Britain became wealthy. Coincided with this wealth, liberal reforms were also introduced in Britain. In this background, the Charter Act of 1833 was passed. One of the liberal reforms was to end the control of the English East India Company on Indian affairs. It was a commercial organization. The administrative power should be taken away from English East India Company. It was in this background the Charter Act of 1833 was passed. It provided another 20 years to the English East India Company to administer Indian territories subject to the sovereignty of the British Crown. As we seen that through the passage of the Charter Act of 1813, the trade monopoly of English East India Company came to an end, except its trade with China and trade in tea. But under this Charter Act of 1833, the company lost its trade monopoly with China, and now the restrictions on European emigration to India as well as the acquisition of territories by the Britishers from India also came to an end. With the removal of these restrictions, the Britishers emigrated to India and they began to acquire territories in India. This act also aimed at centralization of power in the hands of the Governor General of India. This act, it was for the first time, changed the nomenclature Governor General of Bengal to the Governor General of India. Even though before the passage of the act, the Bombay and Madras presidencies had subordinated to the Governor General of Bengal. The nomenclature was Governor General of Bengal, but only in 1833 the Governor General of Bengal was made the Governor General of India. Thus, William Bentinck became the first Governor General of India. All other previous Governor Generals had been the Governor Generals of Bengal, not the Governor Generals of India. It was only in 1833, through the passage of the Charter Act, this change came into effect. the Governor General of Bengal became the Governor General of India. Then the Governor General in Council, in which the powers began to concentrate. This Governor General in Council was given the power to control, superintend and direct the civil and military affairs of the company in Bombay, Madras, Bengal and in other territories. Now, these presidencies of Bombay, Madras, Bengal and other territories were subordinated to the Governor General in Council located at Calcutta. Now, the powers concentrated in the hands of Governor General in Council. The subordinate presidencies of Bombay, Madras, Bengal and other territories were in letter and spirit became under the complete control of the Governor General in Council. All revenues were to be raised only under the authority of the Governor General in Council, as well as the Governor General in Council would have complete control over the expenditure of the subordinate presidencies of Bombay, Madras, Bengal and other territories in India. For all revenue and expenditure of the subordinate presidencies were made under the strict control of the Supreme Government located at Calcutta. Thus, administrative and financial powers were centralized. Now, after the centralization of administration and financial power, the legislative power also began to centralize with the hands of the Governor General in Council. Earlier, the subordinate presidencies of Madras and Bombay had enjoyed legislative power, law-making power. They were able to make legislations according to the local needs and conditions. But now, the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras lost their legislative power. They were no longer able to make a legislation or law-making power, lost. However, they lost their law-making power. Now they could make proposals of legislations. These subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras were able to propose legislations to the Governor General in Council, which the latter was free to accept or reject. These proposals of legislations submitted by the subordinate presidencies of Madras and Bombay. The Act further enlarged the Executive Council of the Governor General by adding one member. Earlier, the Governor General in Council consisted of 3 members from the Pitt India Act of 1784 to the passage of from 1784 to 1833. The number of members in the Governor General in Council was 3, but with the passage of the Charter Act of 1833, the number of members in the Governor General in Council was increased to 3. Who was the 4th member? The 4th member was to be the law member. He should be a distinguished jurist, having well versed in law. His duty was to provide legal opinion in lawmaking. It was his duty. Theoretically, he was to sit and vote at the meetings of the council only during the lawmaking purpose. Macaulay was the first law member of the Governor General in Council. He was a distinguished jurist and he was appointed as the fourth member of the Governor General in Council to provide expert opinion in lawmaking. Even though theoretically he was to sit in the council only during the lawmaking purpose, but he was admitted to all the meetings of the Governor General in Council. In addition to lawmaking purpose, for all other purposes, the fourth law member, that is, the law member, was admitted into the Governor General in Council. A law commission was constituted in 1833 under the Charter Act of 1833. It was with the purpose of consolidating, codifying and improving Indian laws. There existed different types of laws in India. Hindu laws for settling civil disputes as far as Hindus were concerned. Muhammadan laws were made applicable for Muslims in civil cases. As far as criminal cases were concerned, Muhammadan law was made applicable both for the Hindus as well as for the Muslims. In addition to that, English law was administered by the Supreme Court at Calcutta. Again, rules and regulations were made by Governor General in Council. So, there existed different types of laws in India. The Law Commission was appointed to codify, consolidate and improve the Indian laws. Another major provision of the Charter Act of 1833 was that it opened the public offices to the Indians as well as the British subjects, irrespective of religion and place of birth or colour. This recruitment to the public offices were to be made based on merit. However, the Charter Act of 1833 made provision for open competitive examination and recruitment based on merit. No serious attention was paid to this provision. Only after the rebellion of 1857, the British changed this. The higher civil and military services were not opened to the Indians. All higher posters were grabbed by the Britishers. Indians were not admitted into the higher posters. They were given only subordinate posts. In military, they could rise only up to the post of Subedar. All other higher commissioned posters were exclusively reserved for the British. The Charter Act of 1833 was made another significant change. It empowered the government of India to take welfare measures for its slaves. It was one of the significant change or advance made by the British government through the passage of the Charter Act of 1833. It led to the abolition of slavery in India in 1843. Assessment of the Charter Act of 1833. It ended the company's trade monopoly with China as well as its trade monopoly in tea trade in India. Thus, it completed the work of the Charter Act of 1813. Through the Charter Act of 1813, all trade monopolies were not abolished. Trade with China and trade in tea were maintained. But with the passage of the Charter Act of 1833, all trade monopolies, including trade in China, trade with China and trade in tea, came to an end. Now, the commercial activities of the English East India Company came to an end. Now, the company got time to concentrate on administration. Earlier, it was overburdened with the commerce and administration. Now, the commerce was opened to other private companies in Britain as well as to private players. The codification of law was a great significance. There existed different laws and nobody was aware of which law should apply to a particular case. This was the situation in India. But in 1833, the Governor General appointed an Indian Law Commission under Thomas Babington Macaulay to study and codify different rules and regulations which had been in existence. The welfare measures adopted for the slaves and the opening of the public offices to all based on merit were the commendable features of this Act. However, the Act centralized legislative power. Earlier, it was possible for the Madras and Bombay presidencies to make legislation according to the local needs. Now, the legislative power was concentrated in the hands of the Supreme Government at Calcutta, which was not well aware of the local circumstances and conditions in Bombay and Madras presidencies. Now, coming to the Charter Act of 1853, starting with the circumstances behind the passage of the Charter Act of 1853. One of the main reasons was that to end the double government in Britain, the public opinion was to end the double government. One, the Court of Directors, which represented the English East India Company, and other the Board of Control. It was the representative of the British government. The creation of these two, the Court of Directors and the Board of Control, only resulted unnecessary delay in running the official business transactions of the government. It also created undue expenditure. So, the public opinion was to end this double system of government, double government. The presidencies in India also demanded appointment of a Secretary of State with an India Council to handle all the business relating to India. And certain other changes also took place after 1833. Even though through the passage of the Charter Act of 1833, the Governor General of Bengal was made the Governor General of India, no separate governor was appointed for administration of Bengal. It was under the control of Governor General of India. It created fear among other presidencies that Governor General would favor the affairs of the Bengal. And after 1833, major political and territorial changes also took place in India. One, new territories were brought under the control of the English East India Company in India. Sindh was annexed in 1843. Punjab was annexed to the English territories in India in 1849. In addition to Sindh and Punjab, a number of Indian states were annexed by Dalhousie by using the policy of doctrine of lapse, and the newly acquired territory is to be constitutionally recognized. Then again there was a demand for centralization of power. You recall that under the passage of the Charter Act of 1833, powers were concentrated in the hands of the Supreme Government at Calcutta. Legislative, financial powers were concentrated in the hands of the Supreme Government at Calcutta. Even though the Governor General in Council was created, Indians were not admitted in it, nor in the Council of the Governor. So, Indians were not given due share in running the administration of their own country. So, the Indians demanded that they should be given adequate share in running the administration of their own country. It was in this background the Charter Act of 1853 was passed by the British Parliament. What were the major provisions of the Charter Act of 1853? In all other Charter Acts passed before the Charter Act of 1853, there was a clear provision that the Indian territories and possessions were given to English East India Company for 20 years. Even though the Charter Act of 1853 gave the company the power to retain the possessions in India, the period was not clearly mentioned. It was mentioned that until Parliament should otherwise provide. There was no specification of the period to which the company should maintain territories and possessions in India. The Act provided the salaries of the members of the Board of Control, its secretary and other officers would be fixed by the British government. However, it would be fixed by the British government. The English East India Company was to pay the salaries. The number of the members of the Court of Directors, it was earlier 24. Since the time of Regulating Act of 1773, the number of members in the Court of Directors was 24. But through the passage of the Charter Act of 1853, the number of Court of Directors was reduced to 18. Out of these 18 members, in the Court of Directors, 6 should be the nominee of the British Crown. Now again, the Court of Directors lost patronage. Earlier, the members of the civil service were entered into this coveted service through the patronage of the Court of Directors. Now, the civil service was opened to merit by conducting open competitive examination. And in order to conduct the open competitive civil service examination, a committee with Macaulay as the president was constituted in 1954 to prepare the framework for conducting recruitment into civil services examination. This committee submitted its report in 1854. This committee came popularly known as the Committee on Civil Service. It was headed by Thomas Babington Macaulay. It was further empowered the Court of Directors to constitute a new presidency or alter the boundaries of the existing presidencies. This power was given to Court of Directors. By using this power, a separate lieutenant governorship for the Punjab was created in 1859. The Act also empowered the British Crown to appoint a law commission in Britain to examine the draft as well as the report of the law commission in India. Now, the law commissioner, the law member was made a full member of the Governor General's Executive Council. Earlier, he was invited to sit at the council only during making legislations. Now, he was made the full member of the Governor General's Executive Council. In addition to that, 6 more additional members were included in the Governor General in Council. These members were to attend the meeting of the Governor General in Council only for the purpose of legislation. Who were these 6 members? 1 Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at Calcutta, 1 Brother Judge of the Supreme Court at Calcutta, 1 representative each from Bengal, Madras, Bombay and Northwest Frontier provinces. The representative of the provinces should be civil servants, covenanted civil service of the English East India Company with not less than 10 years of standing. This was the qualification required for the membership of the council. The Governor General was also given power to appoint 2 more civil servants to the Governor General in Council. But the Governor General did not exercise this power. This council functioned more or less on the British pattern. These members could ask questions and discuss the policy of the Executive Council. They could ask questions in the council. The Executive Council also enjoyed veto power passed in the Legislative Council. The discussions in the Governor General in Council was recorded in oral, not in writing. And after the introduction of the bills, it got referred to a select committee instead of a single member to study the different aspects of the bill. Legislative business was also conducted in public instead of in secret. Observation of the Act. This Act was passed as a compromise between those who argued for the maintenance of the company's control to govern the India, as well as to those who wanted the control of the British Crown. Those who wanted the substitution of Crown were satisfied with the reduction of the number of directorates from 24 to 18. Of the 18 members, 6 were the nominees of the British Crown. The quorum was fixed in the meetings of the Court of Directors was 10. So, with the nominees of the British Crown, they were able to have a majority. The directors, as you have mentioned, they lost patronage. The creation of the functioning of the Legislative Council was an important landmark. However, Indians were not given any share in legislation of their own people. Thank you, students, for watching this class. Thank you.